Earlier, I spoke to Karl Rove from New York. I began by asking him if he felt sick when he realized there were no WMD in Iraq.
Well, I'm not certain I'd say sick, because we were deeply worried, particularly as the 3rd Infantry approached Baghdad, about the use of these weapons on our troops and on the Iraqi people. But, you know, Western intelligence got it wrong, no doubt about it. But it was the right thing to do to remove Saddam Hussein from power, and the world was better off for him being gone.
Let's be clear, would the U.S. have gone to war if President Bush had known there were no WMD in Iraq?
I doubt that Congress would have approved the authorization of the use of force resolution, nor would the United Nations have approved a resolution authorizing action. Instead, they would have been found other ways to constrain Saddam Hussein's behavior.
But the thing is, when the Americans were pushing for answers, the weapons inspectors were desperate for more time. Why didn't you give them more time?
Well, because he was playing it. We now know in retrospect that he felt that the sanctions would weaken over time, that he was diverting tens of millions of dollars from the Oil for Food program. He had successfully thumbed his nose at 14 resolutions of the United Nations over a dozen years, and he thought he could play us for suckers and simply continue to run the clock. And in the aftermath of 9/11, the calculus had to change.
Did you believe that Britain would stand by America no matter their decision on Iraq?
No, I think the belief was that the United States and Britain needed to act in concert, and as a result they needed to reach mutual agreement as to what was appropriate to do. I don't think anyone believed that the United Kingdom would sign on for anything that any American president would do without being convinced of the correctness, and this was a relationship between equals.
Tony Blair said at the Chilcot inquiry that President Bush had offered him a kind of get-out clause at the very last minute. How did you interpret that? Accommodation
to a ally. President Bush knew that Prime Minister Blair was under enormous political pressure not to be involved in this, and he wanted to give him, he valued the friendship between the United States and the United Kingdom, and he did not want to cause political problems, unnecessary political problems for his friend Tony Blair, so he gave him an avenue out if Tony Blair felt domestic political pressures would make this too difficult to reach for the United Kingdom.
Let's now talk more widely about the war on terror. In the book, you defend the use of enhanced interrogation techniques, but you do say that reasonable voices believe their use was wrong and alienated world opinion. Are you proud of America having used these techniques, particularly waterboarding?
I'm proud that we used techniques that broke the will of these terrorists and gave us valuable information that allowed us to foil plots such as flying airplanes into Heathrow and into London, bringing down aircraft over the Pacific, flying an airplane into the tallest building in Los Angeles, and other plots. Yes, I'm proud that we kept the world safer than it was by the use of these techniques. They're appropriate, they're in conformity with our international requirements and with U.S. law.
But let's talk specifically about waterboarding. It is torture, isn't it?
No, it's not. People need to read the memos that outline what was permissible and not permissible before they make a judgment about these things, because the purpose of the memos was to delineate what met our legal obligations and what was appropriate. For example, every one of the people
But not under the Geneva Convention, though.
Every one of the people who were waterboarded had a doctor who had to ascertain that there would be no long-lasting physical or mental damage to the individual, and each of them were told you are not going to drown.
But John McCain thinks waterboarding is torture, and the British Foreign Secretary thinks waterboarding is torture too.
As I say in the book, reasonable people can disagree, and while I respect the British Foreign Secretary and Senator McCain, I respectfully disagree. And that's the point: is this isn't something about which we can argue. It is not a situation of black and white. It is not a question in which everybody is right and everybody else is wrong.
Did the British know the Americans were using waterboarding to try to gain intelligence information?
You know, I would have to defer to the intelligence officials. I'm not aware of what amount of information was shared. I would suspect, since we were sharing that information with the Democrat and Republican leaders of the committees, the intelligence committees in the House, that there was probably widespread knowledge within the intelligence communities about this information and its source.
That's interesting, because just this week, the head of MI5 at the time, Eliza Manningham-Buller, said the Americans concealed the fact that they were using waterboarding. Is that the case?
Well, as I say, I didn't know. You're asking me to comment on things that I've already indicated to you a few moments ago. I don't know.
In the same speech, she said that in terms of the inspiration for the war on terror, the leadership, Rumsfeld, Cheney, Bush, were inspired by watching the television series 24.
That's laughable. Now that you've mentioned that, if that's her view of life, I mean, I know President Bush, he doesn't watch television much except for sporting events. Same with Secretary Rumsfeld, and while Vice President Cheney was a fan of 24, he's fully capable of distinguishing between fact and fiction. So that comment on the surface of it is laughable.
Okay, now you are criticised by some for having what's called Rovian-style politics, and you quote your critics in the book. They say you used fear-based, smear-based, anything-goes tactics. Was that your specialty?
No, that's what, if you read it carefully, as I'm sure you did, that's what my critics in the media said, and my point in response was that assumes that the voters are dumb and can be won over by those kind of techniques, and I frankly have greater respect for the voters in America than obviously those journalists do, because I think people, when they go to vote, particularly for President of the United States, grapple with a lot of information and try and do the right thing, and they are frankly repulsed by those kind of techniques, not drawn by them.
Everyone knows that you and President Bush were incredibly close. Can you explain the nickname he gave you then, Turd Blossom?
It's a Texas phrase. In West Texas, in the spring, when the rains come, little flowers pop up through the cow patties, through the natural fertilizer of the environment. And the president, at a moment that I probably exasperated him when he was a governor, gave me the nickname.
Nothing to do with that campaign speciality of fears, smears, and anything goes then?
Oh, very nice. But no, because you know what? He wouldn't have allowed that in his campaign.
Karl Rove, thank you.
You bet.